They thought it was just an old farmhouse, until someone opened the basement door and found 47 chained children, calling one woman mother. In the spring of 1834, hidden deep within the tranquil hills of Virginia, a nightmare buried beneath white clapboard walls finally surfaced. What appeared to be an ordinary rural homestead concealed one of the darkest secrets in American history. Beneath the Whitmore farmhouse, 47 emaciated children, none biologically related, most unable to speak English, were found shackled in a cold, stone labyrinth designed not to store food, but to erase lives. They didn't scream, they whispered, and every whisper repeated the same name: Mother Eleanor. This isn't fiction. This is one of the most disturbing true crime stories never taught in school, lost to time until now. If you're brave enough to confront the horrors buried in America's forgotten past, subscribe now, because this historical horror will haunt you long after the final frame. Millfield, Virginia, 1834, just 20 miles from Richmond, where life moved slow and secrets were buried faster. The Whitmore farmhouse stood like any other. 2 stories, white wood, red barn out back. But beneath its floorboards, something monstrous had been growing for over 2 decades. Locals spoke kindly of Eleanor Whitmore, the soft-voiced woman who claimed to be caring for distant orphans from Pennsylvania. She donated to the church, shopped regularly, smiled politely. But behind those smiles and shudders, 47 children were slowly being erased. Her husband, Malcolm, had spent years quietly transforming their basement into a labyrinth of silence. Each stone laid in cash. No questions asked. No one knew. Or so they said. Because the whispers had already begun, and one man was about to hear them. It started with a storm, and ended with 47 children chained beneath a farmhouse. The year was 1834. Spring had just arrived in Henrico County, Virginia, painting the rolling hills in shades of green and gold. But beneath the beauty, something unspeakable was rotting in silence. The discovery came not from an investigation, not from a tip, but from a snowstorm that forced a traveling merchant to seek shelter at the Whitmore property. A quiet, seemingly ordinary farm just west of Millfield. What he heard that night would unravel one of the darkest secrets in American history. For over 20 years, a nightmare had been growing beneath the white-painted floorboards of that home. When authorities finally pried open the locked cellar door, they didn't find crops or storage. They found 47 children, shackled, silent, broken. No one knew their names. They didn't speak the same language. But they all whispered one word through cracked lips and hollow eyes: Mother. The story would shatter a community, send shockwaves across state lines, and expose a hidden network of horror that had thrived undetected for decades. What was the truth behind this mother? And how had a town full of good, God-fearing people failed to see the screams buried right beneath their feet? Keep watching, because what comes next is even darker. They didn't cry. They didn't scream. They only whispered one name: Mother Eleanor. When officers descended into the hidden basement beneath the Whitmore farmhouse, they were prepared for something strange, but not for what they found. In a vast underground chamber, lit only by oil lanterns and the breath of terror, 47 children sat motionless, chained to stone walls by rusted iron rings. They ranged in age from 6 to 16. Some were barefoot, most were dressed in rags, their hair matted, skin gray from malnutrition and years without sunlight. They spoke different languages. Some had no speech at all. But when the sheriff asked who had brought them here, every child gave the same trembling answer: Mother Eleanor. Not a scream, not a sob, just a whisper, passed like a ghost between walls. The name hung heavy in the air, more myth than title, more curse than comfort. These weren't adopted orphans or temporary wards. These were prisoners of a decades-long horror hidden in plain sight. The psychological control was complete. Eleanor hadn't just stolen their freedom. She had stolen their identities, their memories, and rewritten herself as their only family. What kind of woman earns the devotion of those she's destroyed? And what else had been hidden below the surface of Millfield for all those years? The answers would lead investigators down a far darker path. This isn't just a story, it's a warning buried beneath centuries of silence. What happened beneath the Whitmore farmhouse isn't just one family's dark secret. It's one of the most haunting, least talked about chapters in American history. This wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. It was a system, a structure, a machine built to devour the most vulnerable and run silently in the shadows of a trusting town. For over 2 decades, no one noticed, or no one dared to ask. What makes the Whitmore case more terrifying than fiction is that it happened here, in a country that prides itself on freedom and faith. This was the pre-Civil War South. Yes, but not a battlefield, not a plantation. This was a quiet community of churchgoers and shopkeepers, of Sunday sermons and neighborly smiles, and yet 47 children vanished into the basement of one of their own. Let that sink in. This is historical horror at its most disturbing. The kind of forgotten truth that forces us to question everything we thought we knew about the past. If you think you've heard the worst, stay. Because what's coming will chill you deeper than any ghost story. Subscribe, hold your breath, and keep your eyes open. The story is just beginning. From a distance, the Whitmore farm looked picture-perfect. White clapboard siding, a red barn faded by sun, and 200 acres of quiet soil just west of Richmond. To travelers, it was the American dream in wood and dust. But inside, Eleanor Whitmore wasn't raising crops. She was cultivating silence, obedience, and control. Locals saw glimpses, children staring from the back of her wagon, unusually large food orders, flickering lights at midnight. But she had answers ready, always calm, always charitable. Orphans, she'd say with a smile. Poor souls from Pennsylvania. And everyone believed her. Because in Millfield, no one suspected evil wore a bonnet and brought pie to church. But the cracks were forming, and one man was about to see past the lies. Millfield, Virginia. In the early 1800s was the kind of town that seemed untouched by time, a patchwork of tobacco fields, one-room schoolhouses, and slow-moving wagons trailing dust behind them. It was the type of place where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors waved from porches and Sunday sermons echoed louder than any rumor. Just west of town sat the Whitmore property, 200 acres of fertile land, red clay soil, and secrets buried deep. The farmhouse, built in the Federal style, stood tall and unremarkable. White clapboard, dark shutters, a wide porch wrapped like a smile around its frame. Eleanor and Malcolm Whitmore were considered quiet folk, polite, private, respected. He inherited the land from a tobacco fortune, and she arrived from Pennsylvania, a delicate woman with soft eyes and a softer voice. They had no children of their own, or so they claimed. But people noticed. Extra sacks of flour, barrels of salted meat, medicines in quantities no ordinary family needed. Yet every explanation came wrapped in gentleness. Orphans, Eleanor would whisper, touching her heart, and that was enough, for a while. But behind that perfect rural portrait was something no one in Millfield dared to imagine. Until the silence began to break. Eleanor Whitmore was the kind of woman people trusted without thinking twice. She wore her hair in a tight bun, her dresses plain but always pressed, and her words soft as cotton, never too loud, never too bold. In a town like Millfield, where women were expected to be gentle and God-fearing, Eleanor fit the mold perfectly. She showed up to church when her health allowed, donated to every winter blanket drive, and delivered baked goods to neighbors who had lost someone or fallen sick. She never gossiped, never complained, and always had a kind word for children on the street. People called her a blessing, and when she spoke of the orphans, just a few little ones from back home in Pennsylvania, family tragedies, nothing more, No one questioned her. Her stories were consistent. Her tone, heartbreaking but controlled. She wasn't dramatic. She was humble, quiet, unassuming, and that made her dangerous. Because Eleanor didn't just hide the truth, she replaced it. She created a version of herself so perfectly calibrated to the town's expectations that no one ever thought to look deeper. But perfection has cracks. And one curious question would be all it took to let the truth start leaking out. The signs were always there. But in Millfield, people were quicker to explain than to investigate. Mrs. Dempsey at the general store remembered seeing a small face pressed against the Whitmore wagon window one foggy morning. "Just one of the shy ones," Eleanor had said, her voice gentle, her smile unwavering. Thomas Lorne, the storekeeper's son, once spotted what looked like bruises on a child's arm as Eleanor lifted him from the cart. But again, Eleanor had an answer ready. Fell down chasing a chicken. Poor thing. Most people didn't want to press further. It was easier to believe a lie wrapped in kindness than a truth soaked in horror. The Whitmore's supply orders raised eyebrows too. Why would two people need 20 sacks of flour, or gallons of molasses, or boxes of children's clothing? But Eleanor's voice, always soothing, always sincere, reminded them that grief makes people generous, that these were orphaned children recovering from trauma, and in a town built on politeness and faith, suspicion was often mistaken for sin, so they looked away, again and again. But the human mind can only ignore the cracks for so long. And in Millfield, the cracks were about to split wide open. At first, it was just whispers, the kind neighbors pass off as nothing. But then came the late-night hammering, the flickering lantern light long past midnight, the eerie sound of sobbing carried on cold winds from the Whitmore fields. The town told itself stories to stay sane, but reality was knocking, and one night, it would scream. Something about the Whitmore farm was off. While other families in Millfield rose with the sun and retired by dusk, the Whitmores came alive after dark. Neighbors began to notice flickering lights moving from window to window well past midnight, shadows shifting behind curtains, and strange metallic clanging, like chains dragging across stone. The sounds weren't constant, but when they came, they always seemed to echo through the hills on the coldest nights. Once, around 2 a.m., a farmhand named Caleb Norton heard what he swore was muffled crying while passing the property on horseback. But by morning, all was silent again. Porch swept, curtains drawn, Eleanor smiling. No one dared ask questions, not directly, because every strange noise had a gentle excuse waiting. The wind, Malcolm would say. Old wood creaks when the temperature drops. But in truth, people were starting to feel something darker, something cold and calculating pulsing beneath that polite exterior. They didn't have proof, just an ache in their gut that something was terribly wrong. And that ache, it was about to grow louder, because someone outside the town was about to hear it too. Dr. Emery Vickers had visited the Whitmore farm 3 times between 1829 and 1833, but not once had he laid eyes on a single child. Each time, Eleanor greeted him at the door with a soft voice and a long list of symptoms: fever, coughing, sores. But the children, she claimed, were too frightened of strangers, especially men, to be examined. She'd request precise medications, speak knowledgeably about dosages and recovery time, and always paid in full. To Dr. Vickers, she seemed unusually informed, but never malicious. Meanwhile, Reverend Blackstone made regular house calls as part of his ministry. He praised Eleanor's unwavering Christian mercy, especially for taking in so many abandoned souls. But even the Reverend, whose presence usually unlocked even the shyest of children, never saw more than a silhouette behind a curtain. Eleanor had perfected her performance, equal parts grief, humility, and maternal pride. Both men walked away convinced they had witnessed a rare kind of selfless devotion. But they hadn't seen devotion. They'd seen deception, carefully crafted, coldly executed. And their failure to look deeper would soon haunt them, because the next visitor wouldn't be so easily fooled. The illusion began to unravel on a snow-lashed night in February 1834, when traveling merchant Jacob Sloane knocked on the Whitmore farmhouse door. Seeking shelter from the storm, Eleanor let him in reluctantly. The fire was warm, the cornbread dry, the atmosphere suffocating. Jacob later recalled the uneasy silence between Eleanor and Malcolm, the way their eyes darted toward the floorboards when he asked about the children he'd heard rumors of. That night, as he tried to sleep on the parlor couch, he heard something he would never forget, soft sobbing, low and rhythmic, coming from beneath the floor. When he mentioned it over breakfast, Eleanor smiled and said, "Just the wind, dear." Weeks later, 12-year-old Bridget O'Malley, a recent Irish immigrant, went missing after being separated from her family near the outskirts of Millfield. Her trail led to the Whitmore Road, but no further. That's when Elias Walker, a local farmer, came forward. He'd been hunting rabbits near the Whitmore property and heard what he described as screaming, not playful, not normal, real fear, coming from underground. His testimony cracked the final layer of silence. The sheriff couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was screaming beneath Millfield. And now, someone was finally listening. April 8th, 1834, just after sunrise, two men rode out to the Whitmore farm. Sheriff Thaddeus Gray and his deputy, Elijah Moore, expected to silence a few rumors. What they found would ignite a national scandal. Behind every soft smile and southern hymn was a horror that defied belief. And once the door opened, there was no turning back. Sheriff Nathaniel Blake and Deputy Silas Rowe arrived at the Whitmore property just as the fog began to lift from the fields. They expected resistance, denial, panic, maybe even a locked gate. Instead, Eleanor Whitmore greeted them at the porch with a warm smile and a tray of coffee, as if she'd been expecting them. Her demeanor was unsettlingly calm. She spoke with grace, explained again about the Pennsylvania orphans, even produced neatly folded letters, likely forged, detailing arrangements with distant relatives. Nothing about her shook, but Deputy Rowe noticed her hands trembled just slightly when he mentioned the cellar. That was the first crack. Because when Rowe walked around the side of the house, he found the cellar door sealed with 3 padlocks and claw marks etched into the wood, as if someone had tried to scratch their way out. His stomach dropped. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something else. Sheriff Blake returned to the porch and asked to see the basement. That's when Eleanor's smile vanished, and the mask began to fall. What they would find below would destroy everything Millfield thought it knew. Behind the farmhouse, tucked into the earth like a secret too heavy to hold, sat the cellar door, weathered, iron-bound, and locked with 3 massive padlocks that gleamed with fresh scratches. Deputy Rowe crouched down and froze. The wood around the handles was torn, not by tools, but by fingers. Human fingers. Long, deep grooves of splintered pine, clawed in desperation. No animal could have done this. These were the frantic scrapes of someone, or many someones, trying to escape. Sheriff Blake, now standing silently beside him, said nothing at first. He didn't need to. The air between them changed. Something old and primal kicked in. This was not just wrong. It was evil. Eleanor's voice broke the silence behind them. Softer now, trembling. "You don't want to go down there. It's not safe." But it was too late. The truth was pressing against the walls, begging to be seen. Rowe reached for his revolver. Blake ordered the locks broken. And in that moment, the ground itself seemed to hold its breath. Because what lay beneath wasn't just a crime scene. It was a tomb of innocence. And the screaming was about to begin. when Sheriff Blake turned to Eleanor and calmly said, "We'll need to see the cellar now." Something in her finally cracked. Her breath hitched, her smile faded, and her hands, once steady as porcelain, began to tremble violently. "It's not clean," she stammered. It's not safe for men like you. Old tools, rats, mold." Her voice climbed in pitch, her composure unraveling thread by thread. Deputy Rowe stepped forward, gaze fixed. "We heard the crying. Eleanor, we know." And that's when the first sound rose from below, a muffled sob, a voice, tiny and raw, gasping, "Help!" The kitchen fell silent. Eleanor backed against the counter, muttering prayers. "You don't understand. They belong to me. God gave them to me." Her eyes were wide now, her face pale as bone, sweat gathering at her temple. Sheriff Blake didn't blink. He drew his pistol and motioned toward the cellar. "Open it, or we will." In that instant, the gentle mother of Millfield was gone. All that remained was a terrified woman guarding a secret she knew could never stay buried. The descent had begun, and hell waited just below their feet. It was faint at first, barely louder than a breath, but both men heard it. Sheriff Blake froze mid-step. Deputy Rowe turned his head slowly toward the floorboards beneath the kitchen table. Then it came again, clearer this time. A child's voice, no older than 6, cracked and fragile. "Help us." Not screamed, not shouted, just spoken. As if the speaker had lost the strength to beg louder. And then came the weeping. Low, layered, overlapping. Not one voice, but many. A symphony of suffering buried beneath their boots. The kind of sound that doesn't just haunt, it breaks you. Rowe's face went pale. Blake's hands clenched. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't exaggeration. This was a living nightmare, breathing through the floor. Eleanor collapsed into a chair, whispering. "They were forgotten. I gave them purpose." Her words were hollow, but the sounds beneath were very real. "Help us." Over and over. That phrase would follow Blake to his grave. In that moment, he no longer doubted the scale of the horror. They hadn't found a cellar. They had found a dungeon. And it was time to open the gate. Sheriff Blake gave the order. Deputy Rowe pulled the iron keys from Eleanor's trembling hands, but the locks were too rusted, too tight, so they forced them open with a crowbar. One by one. Each snap of metal echoed like a warning, a countdown to something no man should ever have to witness. The final lock fell. The hinges groaned as the heavy cellar doors creaked open, releasing a stench so foul it clung to the lungs, a mix of rot, damp earth, and something far worse, despair. Rowe gagged. Blake covered his nose with a handkerchief. Eyes narrowed. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, its edges worn smooth by the passage of small, bare feet. The lantern's light trembled as they stepped forward, illuminating stone walls lined with iron rings and chains. Then, movement. Small figures, skeletal, silent, blinking at the light like creatures that hadn't seen the sun in years. One child reached toward them, lips cracked, eyes empty. Blake stopped cold. This wasn't a rescue. It was a revelation. They weren't just opening a basement. They were opening the gates of hell that had been hidden in plain sight. And what lay beyond would change everything. What Sheriff Blake and Deputy Rowe uncovered beneath the Whitmore farmhouse shattered every illusion Millfield had clung to. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a blueprint of systemic evil, hidden beneath layers of charm, faith, and silence. But exposing it was only the beginning. Because the real question was, how deep did this nightmare go? The cellar wasn't crude. It wasn't chaotic. It was engineered. Sheriff Blake later described it as a cathedral of cruelty, carved meticulously beneath the earth over the course of 2 decades. Stone walls reinforced with mortar, Iron rings anchored every few feet, each bearing a rusted chain long enough to allow minimal movement, but never escape. A drainage trench ran along the center, stained dark with years of filth. Separate chambers branched off like the roots of a diseased tree. One held punishment stocks, another a crude infirmary with stained linens and empty vials, another filled with scribbled ledgers, names, dates, conditions, transactions. Every detail spoke to a horrifying truth. This wasn't just imprisonment, it was a system, a methodical, premeditated operation designed not merely to hold children, but to control, categorize, and distribute them. The space itself felt alive, not with breath, but with memory, with screams that had long since faded into the stone. No accident, no madness, just cold, calculated intent. And as Blake moved deeper into the warren, he realized this was no isolated case. This was a hub in something far larger and far darker. Deputy Rowe only made it halfway into the main chamber before he staggered back, turned to the wall, and vomited. What he'd seen wasn't just suffering. It was the aftermath of sustained, systematic torment. Dozens of children, their ankles shackled to rusted iron rings, sat or lay motionless on the stone floor. Their skin was pale and blistered, their eyes hollow. Many were too weak to lift their heads. Some were whispering prayers. Others simply stared, no longer believing rescue was real. The stench of rot, untreated infection, and human waste clung to every surface. One girl's arms were covered in deep sores from attempting to gnaw through her restraints. A boy no older than 7 clutched a moldy doll made from corn husk and string, humming to himself as if to drown out the horror. This was not a place of punishment. It was a machine of despair, designed to break spirits, erase identities, and render these children invisible. And for years, it worked. These weren't orphans. These were prisoners of a lie so monstrous, it infected the air they breathed. And Millfield never heard a single cry. Until now. Deeper into the labyrinth, Sheriff Blake and Deputy Rowe discovered something even more chilling than the chained children: organization. One chamber resembled a crude medical bay, a blood-stained table, rusted tools, empty bottles of laudanum, and worn ledgers listing dosages for fevers, infections, and sedatives. This wasn't compassion, it was maintenance. Keep them alive. Barely. Another room was worse, the punishment chamber. Splintered stocks lined the wall, alongside leather straps and paddles soaked in years of misery. Faint stains marked the stones, and one wall had scratch marks, not of someone trying to escape, but of someone counting. Dozens of tick marks in sets of 5, a calendar of pain. But it was the final room that made Blake's blood run cold. Shelf after shelf of neatly labeled notebooks, each dedicated to a child. Names, ages, dates of arrival, compliance levels, punishments administered, physical condition, even behavioral notes. It was a chilling archive of control. This was not madness. It was data, a system, a factory of broken childhoods. And in every line of ink, every cold entry, a piece of innocence had been cataloged and discarded. Blake knew then, this wasn't just criminal. It was historical, and it had to be exposed. At the far end of the cellar, beyond the last corridor chiseled from bedrock, they found it, a narrow crawl space masked behind a false wall. Blake had to drop to his knees to enter, and the air grew colder with each inch forward. Then, the light of the lantern hit something white. Bones. Dozens of them, arranged in shallow pits, covered hastily with lime and dirt. Some were curled in fetal positions. Others had remnants of cloth still clinging to them. Fragments of dresses, tiny shoes, buttons. The count began. 1, 5, 15. By the time they reached 36, Blake could barely stand. These weren't just deaths, they were erasures. No markers, no names, no prayers. Just a hidden graveyard beneath a house that served the community lemonade and scripture. Some skeletons bore signs of blunt trauma, others, malnutrition, and one still had a broken chain around its ankle. This was the final truth. Not every child had survived Eleanor's system. Some had been discarded, forgotten even in death. Blake whispered the words later in his report. We didn't find a basement. We uncovered a mass grave. And it would haunt him for the rest of his life. What began as a local horror quickly spiraled into a national reckoning. Sheriff Blake's findings, photos, ledgers, physical evidence, and first-hand testimony were too vast, too damning to ignore. Within weeks, U.S. Marshals arrived in Millfield. The files found beneath the Whitmore farmhouse revealed a disturbing pattern. Names, payment trails, coded letters referencing deliveries, and correspondence with individuals in 4 other states. This wasn't the work of one woman. It was a network. A coordinated, clandestine ring trafficking children across state lines under the guise of adoption, charity, and religious care. Agents traced shipments, raided properties, and uncovered more basements, each echoing the same dark blueprint. What Eleanor Whitmore had built in secret turned out to be one spoke in a far larger wheel. And it was turning quietly for decades. The federal investigation marked one of the earliest multi-state operations targeting human trafficking in U.S. history. It shook politicians, churches, and entire towns to their core, because for every Eleanor exposed, there were others still hiding in plain sight, and America was only beginning to confront the darkness beneath its foundations. What happened beneath the Whitmore farmhouse wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning, a reminder that evil rarely wears horns. It wears aprons, smiles, and speaks in soft tones. The most chilling part? This isn't ancient history. It's a mirror. And it begs the question, how many doors like Eleanor's remain unopened? If this story shook you, it should. But awareness is power. So if you're brave enough to keep exploring the forgotten shadows of our past, hit subscribe now, because we dig deeper than most dare. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were Sheriff Blake? Save this video so history doesn't get buried again. And remember, the scariest monsters are the ones we never suspect.